Welcome to Psalm 110. And this is a fascinating psalm and a famous one. It's quoted a lot in our New Testament. Now, the challenge with this psalm is we kind of used to reading a psalm and thinking, okay, what was the occasion when it was originally written, before we think about later kind of prophetic fulfillments. With this one, we can't pin it down. There's all sorts of ideas that have been bounced around over the years for why this was written in the first place. And one very popular idea, of course, is that this was purely prophetic. It's simply and purely speaking of Jesus. And so we've got the first three verses that we're looking at here, where it describes the mandate from God to the recipient of the psalm to sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. It speaks of his mighty scepter being sent forth from Zion to rule in the midst of his enemies, and the people offering themselves, and so on. It's a beautiful kingly description. And it could be, at this point, written about any king, I suppose, in the Davidic line, or of David himself. The problem, or the challenge, or the blessing, depends how you look at it, comes in verse 4, where suddenly we've got the statement that you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now, kings and priests together, that's a little bit more complex. Kings couldn't be priests in the Old Testament. The king couldn't come from the line of Levi and Aaron. The king would come from the line of Judah, different tribes. And so you wouldn't have somebody who was both a king and a priest. But in this psalm, we've got a king and a priest. Verses 5 to 7, back to the king again. So it's like a sandwich. The first three verses, the last three verses, speaking of the king and his victory and his refreshing himself there at the end. It's kind of a vivid little glimpse into this powerful and athletic, victorious king. But then right in the midst, in verse 4, we get this statement about the priest. Well, it's a priest from a different order. This is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek wasn't in the line or in the tribe of Levi, line of Aaron. It comes, of course, from Genesis 14. Melchizedek is this mysterious figure that sort of steps out of the mists of time to greet Abraham as he's coming back to with Lot and, the rescue after his defeat of the kings in Genesis 14. And this king priest from Salem, king of righteousness, comes to Abraham and receives tithes from him and blesses him and serves him bread and wine and so on. You can read it in Genesis 14, and you can read the development of the whole idea in Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 7 to 10 or 5 to 10 are full of references to Melchizedek and this priestly order that is different than the order of Aaron. What do we do with that? Well, we read this, and I don't think we have to pin down some original setting for this psalm. If ever there's a psalm that's pointing forward prophetically, it's this one. And so, this is the psalm that references Melchizedek, but most overtly, this is the psalm that speaks of Jesus. Notice the first line. The Lord, let me just underline that there, says to my Lord. That's a really significant line. Jesus uses that when he's communicating with difficult questioners, of course, in the Gospels. The Lord. Notice it's all capitals. That, of course, is the way the English Bible communicates the name of God, the covenant name, YHWH, I suppose we could write. But we don't. We write all caps, Lord, like that, to make it clear this is a reference to Yahweh. And he says to my Lord, lowercase. So this is the normal kind of word for Lord or master or boss, the one in charge. But the interesting word here is my. This is a psalm of David, and David is saying that Yahweh is saying to my master. Who's David's master? David was king. It's not a reference to Saul, the only king before him. So what king can this be? That's why it's so overtly speaking of the coming king, the greater king, who somehow David is acknowledging as being above him. He recognizes God's plan, God's promise, the future descendant of David who would sit on David's throne is actually more significant, more important than he is. You could look at 2 Samuel 7, for example, to get a sense of that. And so the Lord, Yahweh, says to my Lord, the one who is more important than me, you're going to sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And so all the kingly language here is speaking of the future coming descendant of David. He's going to be a good king. But in the midst of it, in verse 4, the Lord, again, all caps, has sworn and will not change his mind, you, same reference, speaking to David's Lord, you're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. That's a fascinating extra piece of information. Put it all together, of course, like the New Testament does, and reveals the fullness of this to us. Jesus, the greater son of David, coming to fulfill the promise and covenant to David, to be the one who in the line of David would be God's king forever. Jesus is righteous king, but he's also priest. He's the one who represents God's rule to us. He's our king, but he's also the one who can uniquely represent sinners like us to God. He's our priest. That, of course, is the big kind of argument that's being presented in Hebrews, but we can ponder it even here in Psalm 110. So read the psalm, enjoy the psalm, enjoy how it points your heart to Jesus, and just say thank you to God for sending David's Lord to represent God to us, and then to be the priest that would represent us to God.